Letters that could kill, trumpets said to start wars, and a statue that wiped out entire families. These are even more mysterious museums that contain items too dangerous to display. In the fall of 2001, most people had no reason to think twice about their mail. Letters showed up, you opened them, that was it. So when a few newsrooms started getting odd envelopes with no return addresses, people were a bit confused, but not necessarily worried. It'd be one thing getting a mysterious package with no return address, but what could be wrong with a harmless letter, right? Well, these were not harmless letters. On September 18th, someone mailed 5 letters from a blue postal box in Trenton, New Jersey. They were sent to NBC, CBS, ABC, the New York Post, and the National Enquirer. Inside was a light brown sandy powder. The first sign that something was truly wrong came weeks later. Robert Stevens, a photo editor from the company that owned the Enquirer, got seriously sick and ended up in the hospital. Doctors eventually figured out he had inhalation anthrax, something most Americans had never heard of. The United States Secretary of Health and Human Services at the time, Tommy Thompson, said it was an isolated case and that there was no evidence of it being a politically motivated attack. But then more letters surfaced, including one sent to senators. And one of these letters literally said, "We have this anthrax." When Senate intern Grant Leslie opened one of the letters, the powder burst across her clothes. A lot of people assume the letters were destroyed, but they weren't. After they were decontaminated, the FBI eventually allowed the Smithsonian's National Postal Museum to take a few of them. You can see them now. They weren't sitting in a display case all this time. They've been locked away for years because nobody wanted the public anywhere near them. When Howard Carter cracked open King Tut's tomb in 1922, he found all the gold and jewels, but among the treasure were 2 trumpets, one bronze, one silver. Like everything associated with King Tut, there was a dark legend attached to them. Supposedly, if you played them, war would follow, but it was just folklore, right? In 1939, the BBC decided to broadcast the trumpets over the air live. During rehearsals, the silver one fell and shattered when someone tried to fit a modern mouthpiece on it. Pieces flew everywhere, and Alfred Lucas, one of the original archaeologists, randomly collapsed. On the way to the studio, the broadcast engineer nearly got hit by a runaway horse, of all things, and the power went out just before the show. Instead of calling it off, though, the broadcast went ahead using candles to light the music sheet for the performer. Well, months later, Germany invaded Poland. World War II had begun. In 1967, a museum guard blew the silver trumpet for testing, and the Six-Day War broke out between Israel and its neighbors. In 1990, it was played again, right before the Gulf War, and in 2011, someone sounded one, and the Egyptian Revolution kicked off a week later. Trumpets are currently locked away in the Egyptian Museum. If you ever end up in Sydney, Australia, and you're the type who likes grossing yourself out, I guess, the Museum of Human Disease at the University of New South Wales is the place for you. This place is filled top to bottom with real human organs, preserved lungs, hearts, brains, all of them belonging to people who died of some gnarly disease. You're literally looking at what cancer did to someone's liver, or what a lifetime of smoking does to a set of lungs. Every jar and display has these simple labels that explain what happened, what caused it, and what the doctors found. Not a place for people with sensitive stomachs. In Florence, Italy, there's a natural history museum called La Spicola. It's the oldest public science museum in Europe, dating back to 1775. But most people come here for one thing, the anatomical wax models. These are hyper-realistic sculptures of human anatomy, created in the 18th and 19th centuries. Full-sized figures with every muscle, vein, and organ perfectly sculpted in wax. Some are posed like they're sleeping, others cut open to show internal organs. They're beautiful, but deeply unsettling at the same time. These models were created using beeswax mixed with dyes, turpentine, and sometimes gold dust to get the colors just right. The problem is wax is incredibly fragile. It melts. The museum has to keep the temperature very controlled. A power outage in summer could be catastrophic. There's also the question of what else is in these models. Some of the older wax formulas included mercury and other toxic substances. In 1966, a flood damaged a bunch of these pieces, and restorers spent years carefully cleaning and repairing them. The Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. is one of the most famous museums in the world, but it also has some legitimately dangerous stuff tucked away in storage. Not what you'd think, either. It's old watches, airplane instrument panels, lab equipment. The thing is, It's all coated in radium paint. In the early 1900s, radium was used all the time. It glowed in the dark, so they used it in clocks, gauges, some old medical tools. Nobody understood how deadly it was yet. Factory workers, mostly women who later became known as radium girls, would even lick their brushes to get a finer point while painting with radium. A lot of them got sick and died from radiation poisoning. Now, those same objects are sitting in lead-lined storage at the Smithsonian. The conservation team uses Geiger counters before handling anything. Some pieces are safe enough to display for short periods, but others are giving off radiation levels that just can't be near the public. There's also a stash of uranium glass and radium health products that were sold to people back in the day. Radioactive water, radium suppositories, all kinds of insane stuff marketed as cures. And yeah, early science, it was pretty reckless. We were playing with things we just didn't understand. So, at a lot of museums, deep in storage, there's stuff that could actually hurt you if it wasn't handled properly. This place looks charming when you first walk in, with its vintage wood cabinets and old medicine bottles. The aesthetic is perfect, so much so that people have weddings here. It's funny when you think about what's actually inside those bottles, though. The New Orleans Pharmacy Museum preserves 19th century apothecary history, which means they've got shelves full of legitimate poisons: arsenic, mercury chloride, laudanum, which is basically liquid opium that was sold over the counter. Some of the liquids in those bottles are original, like they've been sitting there since the 1800s. The museum keeps certain cabinets locked or sealed in glass because the powders have crystallized over time, and disturbing them could be dangerous. There's also a whole section on voodoo cures and love potions that were laced with narcotics. The museum is basically a preserved poison shop. One of the curators joked that if an old bottle broke, they'd have to evacuate the building, which I guess wasn't really technically a joke. At the British Museum in London, you'll find the Unlucky Mummy. It's not an actual mummy, it's a painted wooden coffin lid from an ancient Egyptian priestess who lived somewhere around 950 BCE. But for over 100 years, people have blamed it for deaths, accidents, financial ruin, all kinds of misfortune. This thing was even partially blamed for the sinking of the Titanic. It was first found in Thebes in the 1800s. Early collectors who owned it reported weird streaks of bad luck. Newspapers in 1890s London ran with it, turning the coffin lid into this cursed object. The museum eventually put it behind glass. Even now, though, some visitors refuse to take photos of it, afraid something will happen to them. Also in London is the Hunterian Museum, which had the skeleton of a man named Charles Byrne on display for over 200 years. Charles Byrne was known as the Irish Giant. He was 7'7" and became a public spectacle in 18th century London. But before he died in 1783, he made it very clear that he did not want to be dissected or put on display. He was terrified of ending up in a museum. And they were like, screw that, we're putting you on display at a museum. The surgeon John Hunter bribed someone to get Byrne's body and had it preserved for his collection. And for 2 centuries, Byrne's skeleton stood behind glass, part of the museum's medical exhibit. Then in 2017, the museum finally decided to take it down. They said it was never theirs to display in the first place, and keeping it up, of course, violated Byrne's wishes. Byrne's skeleton is still in the collection for research purposes, but the public can't see it anymore. Is that the right call? I don't know. I think it was wrong right after he died, but I mean, it's been 200 years. Put that big sucker up, let people gawk. The Codex Gigas is massive, 3 feet tall, 165 pounds, bound in leather that's probably animal hide. It's one of the largest medieval manuscripts still around, and it's nicknamed the Devil's Bible because of this full-page illustration of Satan inside it. Legend goes that a monk wrote the entire thing in one night after making a pact with the devil to avoid execution. It's now kept in the National Library of Sweden under tight environmental controls. They barely handle the thing. Visitors can see it through glass or look at digital scans, but actually touching the book is limited to a handful of experts. Not only is the book a delicate artifact, but the inks and tanning agents used in the binding contain toxins that can damage skin. So, in a way, this supposedly cursed book sorta lives up to the legend. And of course, we gotta talk about the Warren Occult Museum. It's not open to the public anymore, but the collection is still there, and it's full of items from actual cases Ed and Lorraine Warren worked on. There's all sorts of stuff here. A cursed piano that supposedly plays by itself, haunted paintings, shrunken heads, vampire coffins, and of course, the most most infamous item in the museum is Annabelle the doll. But she's not the creepy porcelain doll from the movies. The real Annabelle is just a Raggedy Ann doll, like the kind you'd find at a garage sale, which somehow makes it worse. Annabelle in the movies is just so over-the-top looking. But the doll's been sitting behind glass for decades with a sign that says positively do not open. The story goes that priests had to come in and bless the room regularly because stuff would happen whenever people disrespected the doll. The most repeated story is about a guy who kept knocking on the glass and laughing, making fun of Annabelle. Then he died in a motorcycle accident that same night on the way home. Lorraine Warren said they handled the doll like a loaded weapon. They wouldn't move it without saying prayers first. At the Whitby Museum in England, there's a shriveled, mummified hand kept under glass. It's what's called a Hand of Glory, a legendary object made from a severed hand. Supposedly, back in medieval times, thieves would make these from the hands of executed criminals. The idea was you'd light the fingers like candles, and supposedly everyone in the house would stay frozen asleep while you rob them blind. Sounds ridiculous, but I mean, people believed it enough to actually make these things. The one in Whitby was found in 1935, hidden inside a wall of a cottage in Yorkshire. When they examined it, scientists confirmed that it was human. Doesn't really take a scientist to confirm that, though. I mean, just look at it. It is eerily well preserved. What they don't know is how it was preserved, which makes it even creepier. Staff say people get uncomfortable around this thing. One curator mentioned it's the one item nobody wants to move when they're rearranging exhibits. Next up is Mütter Museum in Philadelphia. This place looks like an old library, very classy looking, but won't find shelves of old books here. This museum is macabre, to say the least. You've got jars of preserved organs, remains of conjoined twins, skulls with diseases and deformities. It is gnarly stuff, but it's also really fascinating. I'd check this place out for sure, but what most visitors don't think about is that a lot of this stuff is actually hazardous. Back in the 18 and early 1900s, medical specimens were preserved using whatever chemicals worked. Arsenic, mercury, formaldehyde. And those chemicals don't just evaporate. They're still in there, still active. During some renovations, they actually had to close sections of the museum off because fumes were leaking from old jars. Just being near certain exhibits required safety measures. And then there's the biological side. Some of the tissues came from people who died of infectious diseases back when medicine didn't fully understand how they were transmitted. So there's a real question of whether any of the biological material could still pose a risk. The museum's been pretty upfront about it. A lot of their collection isn't even on display because it's either too fragile or too dangerous. Delbridge Museum of Natural History in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. In 2023, this museum suddenly shut down. They locked the doors and sealed off the taxidermy wing. Turns out the taxidermied animals on display were dangerous, contaminated with arsenic and other poisons. See, back in the early 1900s, taxidermists would soak animals' hides in arsenic soap to keep bugs from eating them. It worked great. Problem is, a century later, you've got displays that are basically toxic. The Great Plains Zoo, which sits right next to the museum, tested the collection and found that trying to clean or restore these things would just release carcinogenic dust into the air, so they made the call to just lock it all away and eventually dispose of it all. Nobody thought twice about standing right next to a mounted bison or elk. Kids probably touched the display cases. The whole time, there were harmful chemicals in the air. In Maryland, you'll find the National Museum of Health and Medicine. There are rows of shelves with preserved organs, deformities, amputated limbs, body parts from Civil War soldiers. Some of it's viewable, but a huge portion is locked away in storage, and there's a few reasons for that. First, a lot of these specimens are still sitting in their original 19th century preservation chemicals. Again, stuff that gives off harmful vapors if the seals break down. Staff work in ventilated areas with protective gear because just being around old jars can be a health risk. But there's also the ethical side. Some of the specimens were collected at a time where standards were not what they are today. Fetuses, body parts taken without proper consent. Museums are rethinking what should even be displayed anymore. But don't worry, there are still tons to see. Bits of human remains from autopsies, battlefield recoveries, and medical experiments. The Ring of Sylvanus is an old Roman gold ring from around the 300 CE. It was found in a farm field near Silchester, England somewhere before the late 1700s. It eventually ended up at a country house called the Vine, where it's kept today. The ring is big, heavy, bigger than most rings, and has a name carved into it. That name is Sylvanius. Not far away, at a completely different Roman site in Lydney, archaeologists found something else, a thin sheet of lead with a curse etched into it. The curse was written by a man named Sylvanius, who said his ring had been stolen. He asked the god Nodens to punish the thief until the ring was returned, naming Sylvanius directly, asking that he be made sick until he gave the ring back. So you have a ring with Sylvanius' name on it and a curse calling for him to suffer because of a stolen ring. No one can prove beyond doubt that this exact ring is the one mentioned in the curse, but it certainly seems like it. Alright, so the Myrtles Plantation in Louisiana isn't technically a museum. It's a historic site, but it does contain antiques and artifacts that the public can visit. And one of the creepiest items here is known as the Cursed Mirror. The plantation was built in 1796 and has a long reputation for strange activity, but the mirror is where a lot of the stories seem to concentrate. The legend goes back to the 1800s, when the home was owned by Clark and Sarah Woodruff. The story goes that a woman named Chloe, who was enslaved at the plantation, poisoned the family. Sarah and 2 of her children died. After their deaths, the mirror in the house was said to be left uncovered during the mourning period. At the time, covering mirrors was meant to prevent spirits from being trapped in them. So because that step was skipped, the spirits are said to be locked inside the glass. And ever since, people have claimed to see the figures of a woman and children appearing in it. A specific handprint also repeatedly shows up on it, even after the mirror has been thoroughly cleaned. The South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology in Italy houses one of the most cursed items in the world. High up in the Ötzi Alps in northern Italy, more than 5,000 years ago, a man was shot in the back with an arrow and left to die in the ice. Today we know him as Ötzi the Iceman, one of the oldest, most well-preserved mummies ever found. Scientists have been fascinated with him ever since his discovery in 1991. And fans of the paranormal have been too, because some say Ötzi is cursed. Rainer Henn, head of the forensic team who handled Ötzi when he was first pulled from the ice, died in a car crash in 1992 while on his way to give a lecture about the find. Then there's Kurt Fritz, the mountaineer who led Henn to the body. He died in an avalanche. Not long after, the journalist who filmed the excavation, Rainer Hulzel, died of a brain tumor at just 47. One of the eeriest cases was Helmut Simon, one of the tourists who originally found Ötzi. He died in 2004, frozen in the Alps almost in the same spot as the discovery. And just within an hour of his funeral, Dieter Warneck, the head of the rescue team, died of a heart attack. Even Konrad Spindler, the archaeologist who scoffed at the curse, passed away from complications related to multiple sclerosis. And Dr. Tom Loy, who carried out Ötzi's DNA analysis, died at 63 before finishing a book he was writing. So yeah, I mean, I'm not one to really believe in curses, but I don't want to go anywhere near that guy. Well, who would have thunk there'd be haunted artifacts at a place called the Medieval Torment Museum? You know what the word actually is. YouTube. Anyway, this creepy museum in Chicago has all the dark stuff you'd expect to see. Torment racks, chains, spikes, all devices designed to seriously hurt people. But for a lot of visitors, the creepiest thing isn't the iron and wood, it's the feeling that something else is watching them. Over time, a few of the museum's pieces have built up reputations, with stories of hauntings and strange goings-on. Take the iron chair, for example. People say that just standing near it gives them chills. Some say they can almost hear screams. The executioner's mask, once worn by the people who carried out death sentences. Some visitors claim it feels like the person who wore it is still there, lurking in the room. Not to mention all the ghostly shadows people see lurking around the place. If you've ever been freaked out by dolls, this next story isn't going to make it any easier. Meet Mandy, the haunted doll at the Quennell Museum in British Columbia, who has her own locked cabinet and a sign warning visitors not to use flash photography. Mandy arrived at the museum in 1991 after her previous owner found her sitting in a box of her grandmother's things. She was supposed to be a gift for a newborn, but the woman couldn't handle it. The doll had been locked in the chest for who knows how long, and the woman reportedly heard crying coming from the chest before deciding Mandy was just too creepy to keep around. Once she came to the museum, the weird activity didn't stop. Staff and visitors have reported all kinds of strange things. One night, a staff member left Mandy in the lab overnight, to photograph her, and when they came back, the room looked like a toddler had thrown a tantrum. Another time, a reporter working in the museum basement heard footsteps above him, while his equipment suddenly went haywire. Visitors trying to film or photograph Mandy often have their cameras glitch out. Even small, harmless toys around Mandy don't stay put. Once a stuffed lamb that was given to her to keep her company was found outside her locked cabinet the next morning. Brighton's Preston Manor is already known as one of England's spookiest historic houses, but in 2015 they received a shop ledger dating back to 1915. The book was donated by Josephine Benyovitz, who, along with her father Tony, had been haunted by the ledger ever since he discovered it in 1988. Tony found it bricked up in the wall of a closed jewelry shop during a demolition, but what seemed like a simple old account book quickly became anything but ordinary. Josephine said that after bringing the ledger home, she started seeing ghostly images in her rug. One spirit reportedly told her that the book needed to be returned to Brighton, to Preston Manor, exactly 100 years after it was first written in December of 1915. Terrified, the family delivered it immediately. A medium who examined the book later said it emanated bad things, and since then it's joined Preston Manor's long line of ghosts, like the Lady in White and the Grey Lady, who are said to glide down the stairs or vanish into walls. Out of Covington, Kentucky, there's a traveling collection of haunted and cursed objects run by Greg Newkirk and Dana Matthews. They call it the Traveling Museum of the Paranormal and the Occult. Instead of keeping everything locked behind glass in one building, they take the collection on the road for people to see. Greg and Dana have been investigating strange cases for about 20 years. They run the site Planet Weird and have spent years collecting objects tied to reported paranormal activity. Some came from their own investigations, others were handed over by people who just didn't want these items in their homes anymore. Rather than store all of them away, they decided to show them off. A few items get most of the attention. There's the Idol of Nightmares, nicknamed Billy, which was found hidden under a house. The family who had it for a while experienced all kinds of weird stuff, mostly violent nightmares and physical disturbances. There's also a black scrying mirror where people report disturbing visions and weird physical sensations after looking into it. But the Crone of the Catskills is easily one of the scariest pieces in the museum, for good reason. It's a hand-carved wooden statue, its eyes pierced with nails and a noose carved around its neck. It was found in a cave in the Catskill Mountains. The hikers who found it brought it home. They started to experience some unsettling things. They'd hear strange knocks, they'd see shadow figures creeping around their home, and then there was this constant stench of stagnant water. But when they finally saw a full-blown apparition of a ghostly crone, they said enough was enough and got rid of the thing. Of course, it ended up with Greg and Dana, who say nobody is allowed near it. This is the only item in their collection that stays locked away. The conjured chest, sometimes called the death chest, is a wooden chest from the 1800s. It's now kept at the Kentucky History Museum in Frankfort. The story behind it goes back to the 1830s, when it was made in Kentucky by an enslaved man named Remus for his owner, Jeremiah Graham. The story goes, Remus was forced to build the chest. Of course, he was never paid or acknowledged for it. Supposedly, he placed a curse on it, meant to follow anyone who took ownership of it. The first death tied to the chest is said to have happened inside the Graham house. Graham's son was placed in it. He was later found dead. As the chest was passed to other owners, stories of death and misfortune followed. People claimed family members fell ill suddenly, died in accidents, or were killed under strange circumstances. Some say the chest was responsible for at least 16 deaths over the years. Next up is the cursed stela, an ancient stone monument that was originally one piece, but it's been split in half for well over 100 years. One half was recorded in Syria in 1879 and eventually ended up in the British Museum, where it still sits today. The other half showed up in London decades later and was auctioned off. In 2014, the British Museum had the option to buy that second half, but they didn't. Part of their hesitation was that no one could clearly explain how the lower half left Syria. Was there looting involved? On top of that, the inscription carved into it basically says, anyone who moves the image of the god Salmanu, hides it, or pushes it somewhere forbidden will be punished. Salmanu will strip away their power, erase their name and family, and leave them living in disgrace. Bringing it to a museum far from its home already counts as breaking the rule, and putting the two halves together in London, well, they think it might have doubled the risk. So between the legal questions and the curse, the museum just decided it wasn't worth it. The Gango statues come from the Mijikenda people along the coast of Kenya. They were never meant to leave. Each one is carved after the death of a respected male elder and is believed to carry that person's spirit. Families use them to stay connected to their ancestors. In the 80s, more than 300 of these statues were stolen though. Thieves took them straight from sacred land and sold them to tourists and art dealers. From there, the statues ended up in galleries, private collections, and museums across the US and Europe. A bunch were sold by American art dealer Ernie Wolf III, who said he believed the statues were legally acquired and no longer spiritually active, which of course wasn't true. After the thefts, elders blamed the missing statues for illness, failing crops, and dying animals. Even outside Kenya, museum staff and collectors started reporting their own issues: accidents, financial problems, disturbing dreams, a constant feeling of dread. Some said they heard voices actually telling them to send the statues back. So some museums did start returning them, but there's still a lot of them scattered around the world. Down in Key West, Florida, there is a Civil War fort that's been turned into a museum, and inside that museum is what many consider the most haunted doll in America. His name is Robert, a seemingly regular-looking stuffed doll made in Germany around 1904. Looks like he came straight out of your grandma's attic, but don't let that fool you. This doll has a reputation that's gotten him featured on every paranormal show you can think of. The story goes that Robert was given to a boy named Gene Otto when he was a kid in Key West. Gene became obsessed with the doll. He'd talk to it for hours, and his parents swore they'd sometimes hear two different voices coming from his room. Neighbors reported seeing Robert move from window to window when the family was out. Furniture would be found overturned in Gene's room, and every time, Gene would say the same thing: Robert did it. After Gene died in 1974, the doll ended up in the attic. The new owners had a younger daughter who claimed Robert tried to attack her multiple times. In 1994, Robert was donated to the Fort East Martello Museum, and to this day, people say that cameras and electronics malfunction around him. Most staff won't go near him alone, and they get letters all the time from people writing to apologize to Robert for disrespecting him, begging him to lift whatever curse he put on them. At University College London, there's a small museum called the Grant Museum of Zoology. It's packed with thousands of preserved specimens, everything from tiny insects to whole animal skeletons, but the real concern isn't what's in the jars, it's what the jars are filled with. Most of these specimens have been sitting in formaldehyde or ethanol for over a century. Formaldehyde, we talked about earlier, it's a known carcinogen, and ethanol, when stored improperly, is highly flammable. The museum's most famous exhibit is a jar containing 18 moles all crammed together and preserved in industrial methylated spirit, which is 95% ethanol and 5% methanol. Staff have to be extremely careful when handling it. If those old seals break down, well, you have toxic fumes leaking into the air. You've also got the Negus collection, which is a bunch of animal heads that were cut in half to show the larynx. Those are preserved in formalin, a mixture of formaldehyde and water. Museums with collections like this have very strict protocols. Staff wear protective gear, they work in ventilated areas, and they use Geiger counters if they think any specimens might be radioactive. There's a town in Quebec, Canada that used to be called Asbestos. In 2020, they changed the name because, who the hell wants to live in a place called Asbestos? But for over a century, this town was home to the Jeffrey Mine, one of the largest asbestos mines in the world, and they have a museum dedicated to it. The Asbestos Mineral Museum sits right next to the old mine, which is now just a massive water-filled crater. Inside the museum, though, they've got samples of chrysotile asbestos, which was once called the miracle fiber, because it's heat-resistant, it's strong, it was used in thousands of products. The thing is, asbestos fibers are microscopic and they're sharp. When you breathe them in, they pierce your lungs and they don't come out. Over time, that's obviously not good. Could lead to mesothelioma, which is an aggressive cancer. The museum displays raw asbestos samples, mining equipment, and products that used to contain it. Staff have to be extremely careful though, because any disturbance to the samples could release fibers into the air. And now we head back to the Science Museum of Minnesota, where there's also a collection called the Museum of Questionable Medical Devices. It's full of these bizarre, terrifying, and completely ineffective medical equipment from back in the day. There's a machine that claims to diagnose your personality by measuring bumps on your head. There's an electric therapy chair that was supposed to cure constipation by just violently rattling you. And then there's the X-ray shoe fitter. This thing was used in shoe stores in the 1920s all the way through the 70s. You'd put your feet into a machine, it would take an x-ray so you and the salesperson could see how your feet fit inside the shoes. I mean, it sounds convenient, except these machines were constantly leaking radiation. Customers were getting blasted with x-rays every time they used it, and people used it a lot. They'd stick their feet in multiple times just because it was kind of cool to see your bones. By the 70s, most states had banned them, but one was still being used in West Virginia in 1981. The museum's x-ray shoe fitter is sealed behind plexiglass now because even decades later, it's still giving off low levels of radiation. In Las Vegas, paranormal investigator Zach Baggins runs a museum full of allegedly haunted and cursed objects. But the crown jewel of the collection is probably the Dybbuk Box. It's a small wooden wine cabinet about 12 inches tall, and it's considered by many to be the most haunted object in the world. The story starts in 2003 when a guy named Kevin Manus bought the box at an estate sale in Portland. He claimed it belonged to a Holocaust survivor who said it contained a Dybbuk, which in Jewish folklore is a malicious spirit that possesses people. Inside the box were some strange items: 2 old pennies, locks of hair, a dried rosebud, a small golden goblet, and a granite slab with shalom carved into it. Manus said that as soon as he bought the box home, weird things started to happen. Nightmares, unexplained smells. His mother had a stroke shortly after touching it. He tried to give it away, but nobody wanted it, so he sold it on eBay. The next owner reported their hair falling out, having hives, coughing up blood. Then Jason Haxton, a museum curator, bought it and wrote a whole book about his experiences with the box. He claimed it made him sick, and that he had to consult rabbis to figure out how to contain it. In 2016, he donated it to Zach Baggins. Post Malone visited the museum and was there when Baggins touched the box for the first time. Post touched Baggins' shoulder while he was holding it, and shortly after, Post's plane had to make an emergency landing when the tires blew out. His Rolls-Royce got in a serious accident. His house was robbed. The box is still on display at Baggins' museum, and people still report feeling sick or uneasy around it. Iceland is full of weird museums, apparently. There's one in a public toilet dedicated to punk music, there's a museum of witchcraft, and then there's the Icelandic Phallological Museum, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's the world's only museum dedicated to collecting private parts from every male mammal species. There are over 300 specimens. The collection includes everything from a hamster dong that you need a magnifying glass to see, a 170 centimeter section of a sperm whale dingus that weighs nearly 155 pounds, and it's displayed in a giant glass tube filled with formaldehyde. Most of the specimens are preserved in formaldehyde or dried and mounted on walls, but formaldehyde is toxic, of course. Prolonged exposure causes respiratory issues, skin irritation, and it's been linked to cancer. The museum has to carefully control temperature and ventilation because if those seals break, you've got toxic fumes filling the building. The founder started the collection in 1974 after friends gave him a bull's junk as a joke, and he spent decades collecting specimens from whales, seals, polar bears, and eventually in 2011, even human donor. The museum gets about 70,000 visitors a year. The Science Museum of Minnesota keeps a lot of its more dangerous items in the back, away from visitors. One of the main things they don't put on display is a snakeskin quiver from the Chachi people of Ecuador. Inside it are thin darts that were traditionally coated in curare, a poison that can paralyze you by shutting down your muscles. The darts are old, but the museum has them carefully stored away because nobody really wants to take chances with something that was designed to instantly drop an animal. They also have a shark tooth spear, a wooden pole lined with real shark teeth, sharp enough to slice skin with barely any pressure. Staff say these kinds of weapons are hard to handle because you can cut yourself just by picking them up the wrong way, so they keep it wrapped and secured in storage. Another item that never makes it to the public exhibits is a preserved green mamba. Even though the snake has been dead for years, the species is known for having one of the most dangerous venoms in Africa. It's just safer for everyone if it stays in the research labs in the back. In St. Joseph, Missouri, there's a museum housed in an old mental hospital. It's called the Glore Psychiatric Museum, and it's one of the most disturbing places you can visit. The museum was founded in 1968 by George Glore, who worked at the Missouri State Hospital for over 40 years. He wanted to show people how far mental health treatment had come by displaying all the barbaric stuff that they used in the past. And when I say barbaric, I do mean it. There are full-size replicas of devices like the tranquilizer chair, which strapped patients down so leeches could be applied to their skin. There's the bath of surprise, which involved plunging patients into ice-cold water. A lot of them drowned. There's the lunatic box, a wooden cage barely big enough to stand in. And then there's a giant treadmill where patients were forced to walk for up to 48 hours straight. The museum also has real equipment from the 20th century, electric shock devices, lobotomy tools, restraint belts, ice picks used for lobotomies. One exhibit shows 1,446 nails, pins, screws, and buttons that were surgically removed from a patient's stomach. Another shows a TV that a patient stuffed with over 500 handwritten notes because he thought a television would transmit them to God. The Imperial War Museum in London has a lot of weapons and wartime objects, including some that are still dangerous. Right in the atrium, there's a V-2 rocket from the 40s. During the war, these things destroyed huge chunks of London. One landed just yards from where the rocket sits now, destroying an apartment building and killing 43 people in 1945. Between September 1944 and March 1945, more than 1,000 of these things were fired at Britain. Tens of thousands of workers died just making the rockets and their explosives before any of them even left Germany, and thousands more were killed or injured when the missiles hit, of course. The rocket at the museum was brought over in 1946. And is almost 46 feet tall, stretching close to the ceiling. It's safe now, but seeing it up close does give you a sense of just how destructive it was. At the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum in New York, they've got green wallpaper from the 1830s. Back then, green would fade or turn brown, but in 1775, a chemist named Carl Wilhelm Scheele came up with a pigment that stayed bright. The museum's sample from 1836 used that pigment. Thing is, it's loaded with arsenic. Gregory Herringshaw, the museum's curator for wall coverings, explains that the danger mostly comes from handling it, saying the toxins are released mostly when they're rolled or unrolled or when you're pasting the back, which adds moisture. That moisture sets off chemical reactions that release the arsenic into the air. The wallpaper isn't on display, it's carefully wrapped and stored at consistent humidity. The Hope Diamond is one of the most famous, or rather infamous, gems in the world. It's this massive 45-carat diamond that's been owned by kings, stolen during the French Revolution, and eventually ended up at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. It's said to be cursed. Legend says anyone who owns or wears it will be met with tragedy. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette owned it. We all know what happened to them. The diamond was then stolen during the French Revolution and disappeared for 20 years. When it showed back up in England, it passed through several hands, and almost every one of them went bankrupt or faced some kind of awful disaster. One American socialite, Evelyn Walsh McLean, bought it in 1911. Her son died in a car accident. Her daughter overdosed. Her husband left her and died at a mental institution. After she died in 1947, the diamond was found in a shoebox in her bedroom. A jeweler named Harry Winston bought it, and in 1958 mailed it to the Smithsonian. The mail carrier who delivered it got his leg crushed in an accident shortly after, and his house burned down. But since the Smithsonian got the diamond, nothing bad has happened. In fact, the museum's curator said owning it has brought nothing but good luck and helped them build one of the best gem collections in the world. Bisby's stoop chair looks like any old wooden chair, and it is an old wooden chair, but the story behind it is way heavier than you'd expect. It goes back to 1702 in North Yorkshire, England, when a man named Thomas Bisby was sentenced to death for killing his father-in-law. The two of them were running a sketchy coin forging operation together, and after a nasty argument, Bisby snapped and took his life. That part is documented. The part people still argue about is when the curse supposedly started. Some say Bisby was intoxicated at a pub, sitting in his favorite chair, and shouted that anyone who sat there after him would die. Others say he muttered something similar while being marched to the gallows. Either way, though, his body was hung on display near the inn, and the chair stayed right where it was. and over the years, stories started to spread about it. It seemed like people who sat in that chair ended up dying in accidents. During World War II, for example, Canadian airmen from a nearby base would grab drinks there, and people swore that the ones who tried the chair never made it back from their flights. By the 70s, the pub owner had heard enough of these stories, and he didn't want the thing inside his building anymore, so he handed it over to Thirsk Museum. They still have it, but it's not on the floor. I mean, they literally mounted it high up on a wall so nobody can sit in it, even by accident. There's a book at Michigan State University called Shadows from the Walls of Death, and it's even more ominous than it sounds. Published in 1874, it's basically a giant collection of wallpaper samples dyed from arsenic pigments, including the infamous Paris green. Back then, people loved bright, unnatural colors for their walls, but nobody really understood that these pigments were toxic. Touch the pages, inhale the dust, it could make you sick or, even worse, kill you. Originally, there were about 100 copies, but most were destroyed because they were too dangerous to exist. Only 5 survived. The ones that did are treated not just as fragile artifacts, but lethal ones. They used to be locked away completely. Even now, only trained staff can handle them. The pigments on the pages are old, but they still pose a real risk. If they flake, tiny particles could get absorbed through the skin or inhaled. The story of the woman from Lem statue starts in Cyprus in 1878, when a small limestone figure from around 3500 BCE suddenly appeared. Cyprus has produced hundreds of figurines like this, and the woman from Lem is shaped like the others, but not quite. The hips are much wider, the details are almost smoothed away, and the legs aren't really defined. It looks like it belongs to the same world, but also like it doesn't fit neatly with anything else archaeologists were finding at the time. What really pushed it into legend, though, were the deaths tied to its owners. The first name attached to it is a man called Lord Elfont, and the story claims he and 7 members of his family died within 6 years of bringing the statue home. After him, it supposedly passed to Ivor Manucci, whose family died within 4 years. Then it went to Lord Thompson Knoll, and the same thing happened. The last private owner was said to be Sir Alan Biverbrook, and after he, his wife, and their daughters died, his sons donated it to the Royal Scottish Museum. Even the curator who handled it reportedly died not long after. The strange part is that when you go looking for these names in real records, they're not there. No official trace of any of them, and the museum doesn't publicly list the statue, but supposedly it is there, maybe locked away too dangerous to display. At the Natural History Museum in London, you'll find the Dalia purple sapphire, a beautiful gemstone with a very dark legacy. In 1857, during the Indian Mutiny, a British soldier named Colonel W. Ferris took a purple sapphire from a temple in Kanpur and brought it back to England. At first, he probably thought he'd scored a prized gem, but soon life started going sideways. His finances collapsed, family members fell seriously ill, and bad luck just seemed to follow him wherever he went. When he lent the stone to a family friend who later took their own life, Ferris started to wonder if the gem was actually cursed. By 1890, the sapphire had landed with Edward Heron Allen, a scientist and writer who didn't believe in superstition, but even he couldn't ignore the odd pattern. A friend he lent it to was hit by a streak of terrible luck, and a singer who wore it claimed she lost her voice. Heron Allen tried to get rid of it, throwing it into a canal, but it was found and returned to him. Eventually, he locked the gem inside 7 boxes lined with charms and sealed it in a bank vault, leaving strict instructions that it shouldn't be opened until long after his death. When he died in 1944, his daughter sent the stone to the Natural History Museum, where it sat until 1972, and that's where curator Peter Tandy finally opened it and found Heron Allen's warning letter inside, ending with a single line: "Throw it into the sea." And the Black Orlov is said to be one of the most cursed diamonds in the world. It was sold to a private owner in 2004, but it's been displayed at several museums, including the American Museum of Natural History in New York and the Natural History Museum in London. Story goes it was originally stolen from a Hindu temple in southern India, where it had been the eye of a Brahma statue. Legend has it a priest caught the thief in the act and cursed the stone on the spot. From that moment, death and disaster supposedly followed anyone who owned it. In the 30s, a New York diamond dealer named J.W. Paris bought the gem to the US to try and sell it. Not long after, he jumped to his death from a Manhattan skyscraper. 2 Russian princesses later owned the diamond, and both ended up taking their own lives within a few years of each other.